Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to this special virtual event on the evolving effects of COVID-19 on poverty and food security. What are we learning from China? I'm Katarla Taylor, Events Manager at IFPRI, and I will be moderating this session. We would like to thank you for joining this virtual event live, and thank you to those of you who are watching this recording after the event. After the COVID-19 outbreak began in December in Hubei province, China locked down many areas to control the spread of the disease, and the economy ground to halt. Since the easing of restrictions in April, life has largely returned to normal, and many economic activities have resumed. However, the lockdowns have had significant and still not well understood impacts on livelihoods and food security. During this session, presenters will explore some of the short-term and mid-term impacts on Chinese SMEs, villages and rural households, vulnerable groups, and food value chains. We are eager to hear from you. To participate in our Q&A session that will follow the brief presentations, please submit your questions on ifpri.org or through our various social media channels, including Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, or by using the hashtag AskIFPRI on Twitter. We have an exciting program lined up for you, and I will now call on Johan Swinnen, IFPRI's Director General, to give opening remarks. Jo?
Thank you very much, Katarla. Thank you for this introduction. It is a great pleasure for me to give opening remarks to this session of today, to this conference. It's also very easy today to give the introduction. Katarla also already reviewed the basic facts on the evolution of COVID in China, and we all know the importance that China has played globally in this pandemic. It's also very easy in a way to introduce the panel today, because the panel is a fantastic combination of very well-known experts on China, China's agriculture, China's rural development. And it's a great pleasure to introduce three of our eminent IFPRI scholars on the field, Chen, Jiabo Jang, and Xin Zhao. And then also two eminent scholars who have long-lasting or long relationship and links with IFPRI. One is, of course, Professor Shen Fan, who is now a professor in China, but was the IFPRI Director General for 10 years until very recently. And of course, Scott Rozelle. Scott's a professor in Stanford, but has worked his entire career on China, and is currently very much involved in some survey work, which he will present today. Just before passing the floor to the speakers, I just want to make the point that actually today we will launch our new ebook, our IFPRI ebook on COVID-19 and global food security. There are several chapters on China in there, and today what we will talk is actually going beyond that, okay, looking at the second phase or the medium term or the evolving situation, depending on what term you, it's almost like the post-first stage of the effects. And I really look forward what we can learn from China, where of course the virus spread longer than in most other countries, in terms of what has happened, how the policy measures have had an impact, etc. So with that, Katarla, I'm very happy to pass the floor back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jo. Our first speaker is Kevin Chen, who is a Senior Research Fellow at IFPRI and based in our Beijing office, and he will share on COVID-19's ongoing impacts on China's agricultural and food system and how China is responding to ensure food security. Kevin?
Well, thank you very much, Katarla. Greeting from Beijing, and I'm very happy to be here. You are aware China is the first country hit by the COVID-19, and also probably the first country to bring the virus largely under the control. So it has been a little bit over 6 months now since the lockdown at Wuhan on January 23rd. Certainly, we are all very curious on what has happened to China's agri-food system amidst the COVID-19. So let me go to my slides 1, which really shows how important the agri-food system in China. If we do look at that data we have in 2017, and the agriculture now counts for about close to 8% of total GDP. But in terms of total employment, it's close to 30%, 27%. But however, if we add the food processing, input sector, trade sector, and food service, the share of agri-food system of a total GDP is going to go up to close to 16%. In terms of total employment, it's up to almost 33%. So that clearly tells us how important the agri-food system is to the China, and it tells us how important to keep a sound agri-food system running in China is during the COVID-19. Next slide, please. And we certainly very much wondering what has the COVID-19 affected the China agri-food system. And since COVID-19 is still ongoing, and we rely on the simulation model, which we built based on the input-output table to look at the impact of COVID-19 on China's agri-food system. And a couple of key results stands up if you look at the figures. And we run the simulation for the whole year in 2020, but break that down for the Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4. As you can see, the effect on the Q1 is all negative on the overall agri-food system, on the agriculture and the food processing and input sector, trade, and also the food service. And food service obviously hit hard the most. But however, if you look at the Q2, Q3, Q4 simulation results, it's quite clear since Q2, the agri-food system starts to recover. But also, if we look at the different food system segments, it's very clear the food service sector was shocked the most, also recovered the most slowly, and over the year is likely to have a negative annual growth. But overall, if we do look at the data, depends on what kind of assumption we're going to give for the trade area. If we assume trade is not fully resumed by the end of 2020, the agricultural food system growth, probably annual growth rate will be around 0.4. If trade sector perform well, it could up to 1.4. So that's our prediction. And this kind of growth is low compared to the normal growth rate around 3 to 4%. So we do project quite a significant negative impact of COVID-19 on China's agri-food systems. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned, it has been 6 months since lockdown in Wuhan. And so we have some 6 months of data, particularly in Q1 and Q2, the actual data which show how China's agri-food system actually performed. If you look at the diagram which I put on the slides here, the growth rate overall, you can see in the Q1, we have blue color, we have orange color. Orange color is the Q2. So you can see across the figure over there, and in the second quarter, the economy performance much better. In second quarter, the overall GDP growth is positive from the negative growth in the Q1 in the GDP, but also for the agriculture sector, for the manufacturing sector, and also for the service sector. They all register positive growth rate. And but however, there are some sectors which are register negative growth rate for those 2 quarters. That is the hotel, restaurant, and also livestock production. That's both negative. But you can observe the negative growth for the livestock production and restaurant sector has been narrowed in the Q2. And if you look at the CPI in particular, which we find that actually in the first half of 2020, the consumer price actually went up by less than 4% on the year-on-year base. At the same time, food price went up quite a bit. It's actually 16.2% on the year-to-year base. But however, this kind of hike is largely driven by the price of meat, largely by the price of pork. And price of pork actually largely determined by the pork price. You can also see the grain price was rather stable, and vegetable price actually show the downward trend. So that's quite clear. Overall, the market has been quite stable. Production has been quite stable. So we see tremendous sign of normalization in second quarter in China. Next slides, please. So with all those stable markets and stable price, China must be done something correct. On one hand, China has been very quick to come up with policy to put in place to deal with the emergency in the agri-food market, dealing with food supply chain disruption and the logistics. For example, as early as January 30, they put joint notice on ensure the effective logistics for agricultural products and inputs. So that's only 1 week after lockdown in Wuhan. And in early February, they put a so-called green channel to make sure the transportation is open and so on. So there are many emergency policy has been put in place. But however, on the other hand, the China has been building what we call the resilient agri-food system over years. So this kind of sound food agri-food system does not come overnight. They've been working on that for quite long. They've been putting in a long-term investment. They adopted a certain strategy called, particular what I like to mention, the rural revitalization strategy. So put the top priority on the agri-food sector. So more public investment and eliminate the so-called absolute poverty and the value chain development strategy and the construction of a high yield cultivated land strategy. All those very much helpful to rebuild what we call the resilient agri-food system, which have been very helpful to cope with the shock of COVID-19. So let me stop right here for the time's sake.
Great, thank you very much, Kevin. Our next presenter is Jiabo Jang, who is a senior research fellow at IFPRI, and he will share the ongoing impacts for small and medium enterprises in China because of COVID-19, based on evidence from 2 waves of phone surveys. Jiabo?
Thank you, Katala. Today I'm going to talk about the impact on small and medium enterprises, where we focus on SMEs, because it's so important. SMEs account for 80% of employment in China. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah. In the last several years, our team conducted field surveys with a large representative sample of private entrepreneurs. In the mid-February, 3 weeks after Wuhan lockdown, we decided to do a quick follow-up phone surveys with the previously surveyed entrepreneurs. The survey was a big success. We completed more than 2,300 interviews. In mid-May, we conducted the second wave for interviews and finished more than 2,400 SMEs. Next. So these slides show the degree of reopening rate in February and May. The black bar stands for February, the white bar stands for May. You can see very clearly most business had reopened by May in all the 7 provinces. Next. However, the restrictions of the COVID-19 caused a heavy damage to SMEs. Based on our February survey, we computed the expected death rate in our sample. That is, firms' cash flow couldn't sustain to the date of expected opening. The rate was very high, 16.5%. After the May survey, we estimated the actual exit rate. It's very close, 17.9%. So given SMEs accounted for 80% of total employment in last year, So we impute the exit of SMEs in such a large scale. It means among the Chinese workforce, 13 to 14% of them lost jobs during this period. That must have a huge adverse effect on poverty and consumption. Next. Also, despite high reopening rate, most productions was running at only partial capacity in May. So this figure plots the degree of recovery in production and employment compared to last year's normal level. If you look at the gray bar, the tallest one, that means 60% of MCEs reported their employment level reached between 76% and 100% of pre-shock level. That means most business, the workers have come to work. However, if you look at the dark bar, which indicate the degree of production compared to the last year, you can see they are quite evenly distributed across different brackets. If you look at the hair bar, that means 22% of firms reported their production level only reached 26% to 50% of the normal level. That means the firms has not fully recovered in their production. Reopening is not equal to fully recovery. Next. Based on two-wave surveys, we also found the major challenges have evolved over time. This slide shows the major 4 challenges: raw materials shortage, labor shortage, demand reduction, and the logistic blocks for 4 sectors: agriculture, manufacturing, business service, and the residential service. In February, it is apparent from this figure, the major challenges are related to the supply side, like raw material shortage, labor shortage, and the logistic block. This is particularly true for the manufacturing sector. The largest 2 challenges are labor and raw material shortage. For the agriculture sector, the major challenge are raw material shortage and the logistic block. Next. By May, the situation has changed. Lack of demand emerged as the dominant challenge. You can see among all the 4 sectors, the biggest challenge is on the demand side. There's inadequate demand, both from external demand and the domestic demand. This is not surprising given 13-14% of people lost jobs. So there's shortage in demand. Also, COVID-19 has spread to other countries. There's a drop in external demand as well. Next. Our survey also show entrepreneurs has become less anxious, less fearful, less worried, and more optimistic from February to May. So the first 3 bars present the indicators on the negative side: anxiety, fear, and worry. You can see there's a drop from February to May. The last 2 columns show the optimism. You can see there's an increase in the indicator that people have become more optimistic during this period. Next. Our survey also has a few questions on the purchasing manager survey indicators, PMI. So for this PMI indicator, if it's above 0.5, this means the business expect to increase their output, orders, or employment. If below 0.5 means they are pessimistic about outlook, they are probably contractions, expecting contractions. Overall, we see expectations on output and orders on the next quarter are positive, in particular for agriculture and the service sector. But for the manufacturing sector, if you look at the arrows, there's the numbers are still below 0.5. It's the expect to a contraction in number of orders and also employment. Given manufacturing sector account for nearly 20% of employment. So this situation is lukewarm. Next. In summary, we found COVID-19 struck a heavy blow on SMEs. By May, most businesses resumed production, but not running in full capacity. the major challenges have shifted from the demand side to the from supply side to the demand side. On the positive note, entrepreneurs have become more optimistic, although the employment outlook for manufacturing sector was lukewarm. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jiabo. Our next speaker is Xin Zhao, who is the Deputy Division Director of the Development Strategy and Governance Division here at IFPRI. And her remarks will focus on migrants and remittance receiving households and present an ex-ante assessment of possible impacts of COVID-19 that could cause declines in income and rising poverty among migrant families. Xin?
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon for everybody. My presentation is a nice transition from what Jiabo just talked about it for SME from firm side. So I will focus mainly on their employee. The most important employee of such a firm are migrants. And then I want to look into the impact of pandemic on migrants, their household income, and the poverty. Next slide. So in Kevin's presentation, he presented some aggregate statistics. Indeed, China has released aggregate statistics for both first quarter and second quarter. For the income information, China released the first quarter. The result from China's National Bureau of Statistics show actually the impact of COVID-19 on aggregate Chinese household income is rather modest, about -4%. However, we feel, especially after hear what Jiabo talk about it, such aggregate data may conceal more serious impact on vulnerable households when they have vulnerable income sources. So for this reason, we have done a microsimulation analysis using existing data of 2018 wave China family panel study. So this is ex-ante analysis that's different from what Jiabo present. So it's a modeling analysis. So in the data, it shows more than 40% of households have migrants or remittance income. So we can expect that the decline in remittance income can have a much disproportionate impact. So for two reasons. The first reason, Jiabo mentioned, SME actually employed 80% of workers. This is very similar for migrants. So 80% of migrants also work in this sector, but also work in SME, and most importantly, work in the sector most exposed to the pandemic shock. So the chart basically shows 5 sectors. Actually, Jiabo cover part of these sectors. So there are high share of migrants working in this sector. So those sectors are highly affected, not only by lockdown, also by later slowdown in domestic international demand. So majority of migrants work in this sector, also work in these sectors, tiny small firms, even not medium scale, it's a micro and small enterprise. Of course, because of this, most of them actually without formal employment contract. Next slide. So migrants, most of Chinese migrants send money back home. So remittance is a very important income source for many low and middle income quintile households. So the top panel of the chart shows the percentage of households in the data with remittance. We can see the bar for quintile 2 and quintile 3 are much higher among rural households, and similar for urban households. So from some point of view, we can see remittance actually contribute significantly to keeping many households out of the poverty. So on another side, for the remittance receiving household, many of their migrant family members working in the highly affected sector, therefore they are highly possible to be adversely affected by the pandemic. Next slide. So we developed a microsimulation model based on the data. So we basically considered a different type of jobs. They are permanent or temporary employee, and they work in which sector, working in what kind of size of firm. We also consider different phases. The first phase is lockdown, pretty much is the first quarter, and the slow recovering phase is pretty much second quarter, and then going down to second part of this year, starting in this month, we can call it relative faster recovering phase. So we see this graph basically gave us accumulated distribution of number of households with remittance, and measured by the decline in their total income, not the remittance income, in their household total income. We can see very heterogeneity impact of COVID-19 on household income, because household depend on remittance income in a different way. Also, their migrant family member work in different type of jobs. So about 5% household with income falling more than 30% during lockdown, 40% falling more than 20%, and 80% fall at least 10%. Economic recovery actually help many households regain their lost income, like Jiabo present. So many workers actually return to their job. However, they still couldn't regain all of their income. Even looking forward to the end of this year, we expect some households and their income will continue to remain below the pre-shock level. Next slide. So because of decline in remittance income, we expect a rise in poverty among such households. So the top panel basically presents the poverty rate for national, rural, urban. We focus particularly on low-income households. Low-income households are those households, they are not poor pre-shock, but they are in wealth quintile 2. So we can see about 13% of such a low-income household actually fall into poverty after the shock. Economic recovery helps them reduce their poverty number, but still some of them still remain in the poor. Even with fast recovering, we expect about 4% of low-income households to persistent fall into poverty. The second chart is about poverty gap. The poverty gap might measure how deep for the poor household in the poverty. We see under all scenarios, a poor will become more impoverished in 2020. Next slide. So what we can learn from China. So number one, important things we try to argue, national aggregate statistic data are important, but that's not enough. It may conceal the fact that households with less secure income were hardly hit during the pandemic. The reason for them to be hardly hit, one important reason is lack of unemployment protection and other social security insurance. This leaves migrants in a very vulnerable position. They are unlikely to cope such a big shock. And then Jiabo mentioned the importance of SME. Indeed, because migrants predominantly work for SMEs, so government support, both in financial and policy side, to such enterprises are the important actually contribution of the channel for mitigating the adverse income effect faced by migrants. However, in the medium to long run, integrated rural and urban social security system, including unemployment insurance, is the most sustainable solution for rising resilience among migrants. The Chinese government has been doing this, and the pandemic has shown this is so urgent. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Xin. I would now like to remind all of you watching online that you can submit your brief questions on ifree.org, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, or by using the hashtag AskIfree on Twitter. We will be coming to our Q&A session following the panel discussion. Our final speaker is Scott Rozelle, Senior Fellow and Co-Director of the Rural Education Action Program in the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. Scott will share on how rural China is coping with COVID-19 and examine the impacts on its 600 million rural residents. Scott?
Good, thank you very much. Wow, the other presentations were very, very nice. And it's actually complementary, I think, to the previous speakers. And this is an ex post, so this is an empirical look at exactly the same issues that Xin Zhao was looking at, and the flip side of what Jiabo was looking at. What our survey is we are looking at outside the epicenter. So we went and randomly chose 726 villages and did phone interviews exactly 1 month, 2 months, 3 months after the start of the pandemic. And then last week, we've been conducting a 6 month follow-up. I have some very brief, very preliminary data from yesterday, and I'll show you some of those. These claim about 25% of rural China's population. Again, it's outside the epicenter. And they were phone calls to individuals inside the village who were not village leaders, who were not party members, but were people that we had identified through the teacher as a mom or a father of a child in the village. So they're just a regular villager. And this is what we found. We asked 4 types of questions. What were the quarantine measures? What were the impact on health in those villages? And then what were the employment, education, and non-COVID-19 health impacts? That's what the cover. And what you see, that the lockdown was absolutely draconian. It was every village. Now remember, these are thousands of kilometers away from the epicenter, and nearly every village, there was no travel into the village, nobody could leave the village, nobody could walk around the village, and children weren't permitted to play outside. As you see, 88% of the villages for 2 months, kids were inside the household and couldn't leave. And so these were very serious. And night and day, these are photos of some of the villages in our study. We ask our informants to go outside of their house and take a photo of the streets outside. And you can see not one kid, not one person was walking around. So this is total lockdown. So the good news of a total lockdown is after 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, the 700 villages that we surveyed had around 700,000 villagers in them. Remember, these are, so because of the timing of this, in these villages were all the migrant workers that both Jiabo and Xin Zhao have been talking about, who are back home for New Year's and can't leave. Out of all these 700,000 workers, 10 of them had viruses, infections. Of the 700 villages, only 4 villages had any infections at all. And so the infection rate is about 0.001%, which is exactly what China's infection rate is outside of Hubei. Now, Hubei is much, much higher. I put yesterday's US rate per million, right? So China is 12 per million. The US is now 10,000 times that much at 13,000 per million. And California, we're quite close behind there. So that's the good news. The bad news is exactly what Xin Zhao predicted. This is so I think it's so your micro prediction model is very good, Xin Zhao. And in February, employment was essentially zero. No one could leave, no one could return. But by March, when these restrictions started to fall, as you saw, people started to go back to work. It was only a month, 2 months out. There was still 66% of people were stuck at home. It's over half by April. And so this is that slow recovery that we're seeing. Unfortunately, we don't have May to line up to Xiaobo's job. Now, I think we're a little bit higher unemployment rate than what Xiaobo was showing if I had to predict our May results. And that's probably because you remember we don't have the coastal provinces in there, and probably the rate going back in those provinces are higher. So these are poorer, more remote villages. But it lines up very much. The decline of employment, of course, is coupled with the decline of income. And as you see, almost all villages had big declines of income in February, obviously. In March, almost 20% of annual per capita income for rural families at the end of these 2 months. And here's our July numbers, okay? Almost exactly 6 months after lockdown, 4.5 months after relaxation, we find that still 25 to 30% of rural workers are without a job. Some of them have decided not to go back to work, like mothers who have to stay with their kids because school is not in session. And there's also workers who do have a job, and this is also exactly what Xiaobo and Xin Zhao are finding and predicting. Hours and wages are all lower than last year at this time for the 75% of the workers that have gone back to work. And I think because of lack of time, I took the slide out. What Xin Zhao was talking about, the need for unemployment insurance. The total number of national unemployment insurance after 3 months into these villages was exactly zero. Okay, there was no unemployment given by the national government. Some local governments were passing out food. There were some local transfers to a very small number, the relatively wealthy villages there. And so how do villagers cope with that? Well, you can see the biggest impact, this is after 3 months, we're doing this right now for the rest, is this big reduction of spending on food. So it's, and we find big negative effects on nutrition of especially children. We've been following up in the schools that these kids are going to once they finally go back to school. They borrow money from relatives and friends. They reduce spending on education. They reduce spending on healthcare, so non-COVID-19 healthcare. But you can see there's almost no incoming funds from government sources. We have an urban sample that we followed up with that's not included here, and the amount of funding of urban residents who almost didn't lose their job was positive. They've been given consumption coupons, they've been given employment assurances, haven't been able to be laid off, and of course they were the first ones rehired. And so there's this very big inequality between the state's support of the different sectors of the economy. And finally, just my last set of impacts. We've been doing a lot of work on this. My group is the Rural Education Action Project. So we've been following students and actually now going back to their schools now that they in April and May, many of them have been going back to school. And you can see there's good news and bad news. The good news is there's been a lot of rise and coverage of online learning. I mean, this is better than Palo Alto during the COVID virus rise here in California, almost 80 to 90% of schools have organized and were providing during February and March online learning to kids. The problem is, of course, is that the internet's not always good. Students have to go outside to get a better signal, but they can't go outside to get a better signal. Students are unable to communicate with their teachers. And so according to an early July survey, this is in one of our provinces, of 600 urban and rural teachers about their students. Here it is in July, right? They're just finishing this school year. And the urban teachers say, yeah, we're about a month behind. We lost a month of learning, out of the 3-month online learning. So, not great, but not bad. But rural students are 3 months behind last year's. And in a very competitive education system that already has a big gap between urban and rural students, I think that this is something that really needs to be attended to. So in summary, China's lockdown was total. It was nationwide. And of course, they had phenomenal success in reducing COVID-19 infections and death. We spend some time in another paper talking about what would have happened if there had been infections spread out to these villages and counties, poor rural counties, where the health systems weren't very good. And I think that can't be minimized. But there's been a huge cost in employment and income and education. And I'd like to just say that Xin Zhao's real focus on the government needing to get an unemployment and a social security system set up, not only just for pandemic response, but for all responses. I think that that's needed, and we didn't see any results that it's in place right now. So I'm going to stop right there and really thank IFPRI, thank Yo and the whole staff for setting this up. It's been very, very interesting.
Great. Thank you, Scott, and to all of our speakers. We will now move to the Q&A portion of the program. And I'd like to remind our audience that we want to hear from as many of you as possible. So please be brief with your questions when you type them into the chat box or using the hashtag #AskIFPRI. And please share your name and institution if you wish. I will read one question at a time and direct it to the relevant speaker. And please note that in some instances, in the interest of time, we will consolidate your questions. The first question that I have today is for you, Kevin, and it's coming from Nasri Othmane of the African Sustainable Food International. His question is, how can SMEs in Africa benefit from the Chinese experience to help manage its increased food insecurity and fight the spread of poverty?
Thank you, Katala. This is certainly very important questions. And from the experience in China, and certainly as Scott mentioned earlier, and China has been adopting very stringent policies to control the spread of the COVID-19. And that certainly come with a cost. And the most important thing, I think, we have to realize now, now we look at the new cases of infected cases around the world. You look at the case in India, it's almost 60,000. If you look at the infected case in Africa, it's rising very fast, probably faster than any other part of the world. So this is very alarming, and that could put a lot of restrictions on how many the small and medium enterprise can actually remain open and provide employment opportunity, provide an income source for the needed households. And so that's going to be a very much the important thing that for the Africa continent to look at. So if we look at the Chinese case, certainly the most important thing is how you take for example, what we call the balanced act. In one hand, you have to control the virus, and on another hand, you have to keep a certain level of economic ongoing, particularly with those small and medium enterprise, because it's provide the major source of the income for the vulnerable group. So the way China has been coping with that is really adopting what I call very much the risk-based management practice and risk zoning in some place, and make sure that you don't adopt the one policy for the whole nation, but you have to based on the different risk level in the different region, and to manage the opening of the small and medium enterprise, and make sure that some level of economic activity can be active while you control the disease. So that's probably the most important thing to do.
Great, thank you, Kevin. And so Jiabo, I'll come to you. A question that has come in is on the SMEs recovery, and the person is asking, how has the government been able to support SME recovery in China?
One major intervention, the government tried to give a lot of financial help to the SMEs. But what we found, that kind of policy was not very helpful. Only 15% of SMEs report they received financial support from the government. During the normal times in the last few years, the percentage was 13%. So there were only 2 percentage point improvement, despite the massive spending support. Other policies are more supportive, more helpful, such as waive some of the fees and reduce the taxes. About more than 40% of SMEs report they receive some reductions in fees and tax. The third one is on the reduction in rent, but there's only part of some firms receive the help because the landlords mostly are also private firms. They couldn't give the reductions in rent. So the fourth one is on the employment security contribution. The government allowed firms to delay the payment of the social security for the employees. But this policy only applied to medium and large firms. For the self-employed business and very small enterprises, employers don't pay the social security for their employees. So the policy didn't apply. So overall, the policy was not very helpful overall. So based on all studies, we argue support for the vulnerable groups, vulnerable population, would in turn will generate demand for SMEs. Because what we found, the biggest challenge for SMEs is lack of demand. Consumers don't spend. So if give the money to consumers, the vulnerable groups, the poor, they will spend, which in turn will stimulate SMEs. So that's probably a better policy.
Great, thank you, Jiabo. I'll come to you, Xin, and the question for you is, has the survey or the analysis considered gender disaggregation?
Yes, the short answer is yes. So in the survey, actually, this is a very good survey. It's not just by household, also by individual. So at the individual level, actually, the survey show about 1/3 of migrants are women and 2/3 are men. However, when we did our scenario analysis, we noticed and affected female and male migrants, the gap start to shrink. About 66% of female migrants are expected to be affected. About 77% of male are affected. And also in terms of their falling income, the gap actually further shrink, especially in the slow recovery period. The reason is most of female migrants working in the much more vulnerable sector, like hotel, restaurant, hospitality, and this kind of sector. The recovery for this sector is not just supply side issue, like Jiabo said, scarcity, that's also demand side issue. And then we also predict for the whole year, the impact on male and female become almost the same. Back to you, Katina.
Great, thank you, Xin. Scott, I'll come to you. And the question for you is, have the workers who have returned to their villages and are currently unemployed, are they generally engaged in farming?
And of course, if you look at if you look at unemployment statistics for China, right, you see for the nation, the reported government figures, it's gone from, I don't know, 5.2% to 6.1%, right? I mean, that's what China says that is, but then you look at our numbers from all three of these papers, and what you see is that, you know, literally hundreds of millions of workers were affected, these rural workers. You know, how do you basically put those two things together? And what the theory in the government is that every one of the rural workers in China that are working in these SMEs and they're working in hotels and restaurants, they're from a farm. And so if they get laid off their job, they go back to their farm and they're farming, so they aren't unemployed, right? And so so that's why, and that's how they count it. And indeed, every single one of these rural people that we've been talking about, and there's 800 million rural residents in China, every single one of them does have a farm. They're very small. Now, the question that was asked was, are they farming when they go back? In other words, is this another source of them sort of dampening the negative impact? And the fact is a massive number of these workers are between 20 and 35 years old, and they've never worked off the farm. They've never worked on the farm. They don't know how to farm. They have absolutely no interest in farming. And so that we found that very, very few people went back to the farm and started farming. There's a small number, mostly elderly men, right, from 40 to 60 years old. So those men that had been in the labor force that came back, they did start participating in farming once they got back. There's one thing I would like to ask Xin Zhao a little more. In our data, what we do find is that women actually are more impacted than men by COVID-19, in this, and they don't go back to farm either when they've lost their job. But the fact is they choose not to go back to work because they've basically been stuck at home taking care of the kids. The kids don't go back to school until mid-May, that those households where the woman was a big money earner, the households had the biggest impact.
Great, thank you, Scott. And now I've got a broad question that I'll throw out for Kevin and any of the other panelists that may wish to comment. And that question is, do you have any thoughts on how China's experiences will affect the world, given that it's one of the largest global economies? So I'll start with you, Kevin, if anyone else wants to come in.
Sorry, Kada, could you repeat the question quickly? Yeah.
Sure. The question is, do you have any thoughts on how China's experiences will affect the world? The question is coming from Cecilia Acun from the University of the Philippines in Los Baños. And so her question is, any thoughts on how most of the world will be affected, given that China is one of the largest global economies?
Yeah, I think the COVID-19, the impact on the China's agri-food system going to have quite large significant impact on the world as well, and particularly on the trade sector, for example, and in the imports and export sector, that sector has been heavily impacted by the COVID-19 outbreak. And so there are many countries, for example, introduced the new trade barriers, ban the exports, and they put additional trade barriers on the food imports, for example. So this kind of issues going to be rise more and more as the COVID-19 has been spread all over the world, and in many other parts of the world now, they are still experiencing very severe shock, which brought by the COVID-19. So whether this kind of issue and the situation we are facing, I'm sure that going to produce a very profound impact on the world's food economy. And so if this kind of situation prolong, particularly in the low-income country, like in some of the Africa countries, this kind of shock will bring very severe impact on the vulnerables in the food security areas. Back
Great,
to you.
thank you. Great, thank you. Does anyone else care to comment?
Yes.
Scott, Zhenshin, I can hear you, and then we'll come to Scott.
So me first? Okay, so actually I like to point out the impact on China's neighboring country. So I also have worked for Myanmar. So the Myanmar's agriculture export heavily depend on the border trade with China. So during lockdown period, all of a sudden the trade was stopped. So a lot of perishable fruit actually basically lost. So now China start to open, but they have much more restricted policy. So therefore, Myanmar expect this year their agriculture export will fall significantly from the last year. Back to Scott.
Yeah, and it's sort of the same sort of idea, but it's sort of a two-edged sword. One is all the export restrictions and import restrictions from China are lowering demand from the traditional sources, fruits and vegetables from Myanmar, but also grains and staples from the U.S. and from South America, and of course, what overlies that, right, is the U.S.-China deteriorating relationship, and that's drastic. Now, the good news is, it depends if you're a farmer or if you're buying on the international market, is prices have fallen in the U.S. and the U.S. is looking at other markets around the world. So it's a good market to import from, mainly because of not only increased restrictions of China for importing, but the whole deteriorating relationship. So it's really complicated, and there's supply and demand issues interacting, and I think that one of the things that I think international organizations have to do is try to really help developing countries understand the markets out there and the credibility of them, or the risks involved in entering them and trying to cover their food gaps.
Great, thank you, Scott. One last check. Does anyone else care to comment on that question before I move on? Okay, so our next question is for you, Jiabo. It's coming from Bibi Gonzalez, who's based in Guatemala. He's saying, from your presentation, we've seen that demand has lowered in multiple fields, with agriculture being one of the least affected. We also saw that the manufacturing sector is not performing great. Do you think there's a shift in increasing behavior and an increasing emphasis for natural foods? Are people looking at prices or just generally trying to be healthier?
Thank you. This is a very good question. You have some eye noticing the agriculture sector doing well in terms of demand. So basically, people still need to eat. They still need consume vegetables, grain, etc. So the demand for agriculture products are still there. But for manufactured goods, the demand, China is the largest exporter. The external demand has dropped. So that's a big factor. Another factor is from the domestic demand. I said earlier from Scott's presentation, Xin Zhao's presentation, because so many workers were laid off. So their demand for daily goods had dropped a lot. So that has a big impact on manufacturing sector. So that's the main reason. There's a differential effect on the two sectors.
Great, thank you, Jiabo. Kevin, a question for you coming in from Ajay Singh of India, and it's calling, I guess, for your opinion on how long will it take for China to recover to levels pre-COVID-19?
Well, this is a very challenging question to answer. I'm not a fortune teller in the way, and I cannot really predict that. It depends on so many factors. Even in our simulation, and we have assumed, for example, the recovery period will be, we have 3 scenarios until end of June. It's largely proved we are wrong. And we have second scenario, say in the end of September. We have another scenario, the recovery will last until end of December. Then again, the trade, as we mentioned, US-China trade dispute that's also bring a lot of uncertainty in this issue. So that's make the prediction very difficult. However, come back to our prediction, come back to the first to the second quarter, China economy, the performance of China, the economy in second quarter, I suddenly become more optimistic, let me put that away, right? You see the number which I show, and obviously the Chinese economy seem to perform much better in the second quarter. I think much better than most people would predict. And so in that note, my prediction will be, I hope, and the recovery in China will be on quickly, probably by end of hopefully the third quarter. And but then again, it's largely contingent on how the trade sector going to perform, the trade relations.
Great, thank you. And so Scott, I have a question for you that's coming in from Sarbswar Sahu. And this is a question that parents are asking all over the world, right? So the question is, do you know what the plan for the reopening of schools in China is, and any lessons for the rest of us?
Yeah, indeed. It's a question that there's a big local school district meeting last night here in Palo Alto asking that exact question, and Stanford's trying to decide. But in China, they as you see, there was a lot of so there's a huge effort to give online in-home schooling to kids, and virtually 90% of villages, the most remote villages in China, were getting online learning. And it was coming through a whole bunch of different venues, TVs, cell phones, and internet computers. But of course, wasn't very effective for many of the villages because of problems with infrastructure. And so there was big pressure in China, like everywhere else in the world, to open up those schools. China took a very slow approach. They basically said, okay, we're going to let go a gradual phase back, and they opened up 6th grade, 9th grade, and 12th grade. Those grades that were going to graduate to the next level, take a competitive exam at the end of the year, and they brought them back in April, basically. But then they gradually came back in province after province through May. By the 1st of June, virtually every school was back in session, except no preschool, so ages 4 to 6. And then the days for younger kids, 6, 7, and 8, were restricted half and half to try to keep social spacing, social distancing among kids that couldn't do it. So there, and until today, kids are still wearing masks in many schools. And so there's a huge number of gradualism to get back into school, and then social distancing measures once they're in. And schools are very shut down. It's hard to get back into schools for anybody from the outside. And so they're still trying to keep any possible infections from coming back.
Great, thank you, Scott. I'll now turn it over to Yo Swinen, and Yo, I'll let you pose the last question.
Thank you very much, Katarla. I actually had a whole series of questions, but I want to make sure that we have enough time for Schengen at the end, because I'm sure I would also very much would like to hear his view on things. So I'm going to, some of the questions have been asked already. I'm going to have two questions. Okay, one is for Jiabo. And Jiabo, can you tell us a bit how the SMEs have done compared to the large scale companies? Because there's different hypotheses, and apparently it seems to be different in different countries. On the one hand, that so the large companies have performed better for a number of reasons, but sometimes also because they're more relying on hired labor versus family labor, they have done actually worse in some countries. So that would be my question to you. And coming back to Scott, this is actually a general question, but since we have limited time, Scott, you said, I mean, China has done fantastically in terms of reducing the COVID infection with a strong lockdown, but it's a huge economic cost, okay? But of course, huge is relative, right? So if we look now across the world and what is unfolding across the world, is this cost so huge compared to other countries which have not had such a severe lockdown? I know only future can tell, but it's certainly something we should think about. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. For our survey, we focus on the small medium enterprises. So they suffer more than the large firms. So if you look at the Chinese stock market, that's mainly lists the large firms. They are doing extremely well, like the US stock market. Therefore, two reasons. One is many firms are high-tech firms. High-tech firms benefit from the coronavirus restrictions. So many businesses going online. So this generates demand for the high-tech firms. Also, the workers in high-tech firms can work from home. The net impact on them is minimal. This one. Secondly, the government policies essentially mainly target the big firms. They benefit from the policies, like the financial support. They can get loans, also tax reductions, also the deferral of the Social Security payment. So their workers, they can reduce their burdens. For SMEs, they didn't enjoy the policy before. So right now they couldn't enjoy the new policies. So there's also the policy difference.
Great, thank you. And thank you. And Scott?
Yes. Oops, yeah, I'm unmuted. So it's yeah, that's the $64,000 question, right? Is you know, what are the costs and benefits you know, of these lockdowns? You know, I think that we're starting to get an idea of the costs, as you see from these different different studies, and the benefits, right? The rebound of some of the markets Kevin was talking about, and certainly the rebound and optimism that Jiabo and Xin Zhao were looking at. Yeah, there's also other costs out there, you know, of these severe lockdowns and then relaxed, right? Is during the very severe lockdowns, you can't even go to the hospital. And so there was a very famous paper by a former Stanford GSB PhD who wrote about there'd be 100 times more deaths from locking down the economy and not having people have access to healthcare. And you see that 10% of rural people reduced healthcare expenditures today, right? And you know, what is the negative? So once we get all those together, we can do your cost benefit analysis. I think the problem is when you try to take lessons from China is, can any other country in the world do it on the massive size economy, very decentralized, very rural, it's still 60% rural, can they do a lockdown like this? And unless you have an organized hierarchy with party organizations at every single level, you know, in 1 week, 800,000 villages had every exit and entry to that village blocked, right? In 1 week. And you know, I think that I think that those are and every country has to make those calculations. And I would say China benefited from locking down. Okay, I think rather than to let it spread like it has in the U.S., for example, but there are huge costs to that, and I don't think many other countries can rely on that same cost-benefit formula.
Great, thank you very much, Scott, and thank you to everyone for participating in the discussion. I would like to now call on Shenggen Fan, who is the Senior Chair Professor at China Agricultural University and IFPRI's former Director General. And Shenggen will give us concluding perspectives. Over to you, Shenggen.
Thank you, Katala. Thank you, Joe, for inviting me to give my thoughts. I used to do that at IFPRI, just to give some sort of summary for various policy seminars. Let's see whether I have that skill. I came back on January 6th, after IFPRI. Just 2 weeks after that, COVID-19 came. So I dropped all my planned work with China Agricultural University to zoom in to focus on COVID-19. So immediately, Kevin and I formed an informal sort of online discussion group. Includes some of the experts or scholars from different universities, different parts of China, including some of the professors in Wuhan, just to compare the notes, to go to the supermarkets, wet markets, to see the food prices and so on. And then we advise the government what sort of action we should take. I thought that was a really rewarding experience. So we had several rounds of informal sort of online discussions. We also had a couple of rounds of more formal discussion, open discussions on the responses, how China could have responded better and so on. And as a result of that, Kevin and I edited a special issue at the China Agricultural Economic Review. We had, I think, 6 papers in the first volume and another 2 in the second. So I thought early action from researchers actually is quite important not only for Chinese policymakers, but also for the whole world. We actually were the first group to alert the world that if we don't do it right, we could face a global food security crisis. Africans, South Asians, Latin Americans, we stated that in February, so as early as February. So now what I learned from various speakers, number one is, I think February, March was the worst time here in China and here in Beijing. I was locked in my apartment here without going anywhere. So that was dark days for China. So the food supply chain was broken, particularly for poultry, for livestock, for seafood. All this were basically broken. The stable production were not much affected because they were already planted, already in the field and so on. And then yes, the rural migrants, they were in their hometown for Chinese New Year. They couldn't travel back to their job. So basically they lost probably 1 month, maybe 2 month income. So you can calculate how much income they have lost. Then obviously the food prices went up in February by quite a bit, and in March continues to rise and come down quite a bit in April, May, and then June. So you can see that February, March were hit the hardest in many aspects of our lives, economies, and so on. So April, May, and June are the recovery month, and I have seen that. So people begin to come back to the cities to work. The rural migrants begin to resume their work. Food production, food prices begin to drop, and so on. And by July, I think the latest figure I have seen, informal and formal data, is China basically recovered, mostly recovered, except some of the very hard hit regions in the middle part of China. Now, so what we have learned here, after COVID-19. I think COVID-19, to some extent, is a wake-up call on our food system, on agriculture system. So two things I learned. One is resilience. So our food system, future food system must be resilient. Nowadays, we are facing so many shocks. COVID-19 is only one. The big floods in southern China, in the Yangtze River Delta, invasion of the African desert locusts, invasion of four-army worms, then African swine fevers. You can see many, many risks and threats are coming to hit the food system here in China. So how can we rebuild the system better, resilient, is one area we must work on. The second is inclusion. We learned that the COVID-19 hit the poorest the hardest. The rural migrants, the poor consumers in urban centers, women. I'm very sure the women are hit very hard because women usually are engaged in service sector, hotels, restaurants, and so on. Even today, many restaurants here in Beijing are not in full capacity, maybe only 50%. The hotels, there's a Friendship Hotel I used to stay. I happen to be there today. It's almost empty. And all these hotel service sectors used to employ women. So they were hit very hard. So how can we rebuild a system for better inclusion is another big question we needed to take on. Now for China, I think there are a couple of issues we needed to look at. One is rural-urban divide. So I really learned quite a bit from Scott's presentation. The rural areas has been affected much more than urban areas. Urban areas, the big firms, governments, universities have not been affected. Our salary here in Beijing has not been affected, zero. Maybe to some extent, there are even some subsidies. So now, also in terms of region, ironically, it's the middle part of the country that have been affected more. So coastal areas like Jiangsu, Zhejiang, Shanghai, their economies are very robust. They recovered very quickly. And then Western China had a special strategy this year to end poverty by 2020. And lots of investment and lots of efforts went there to help the poor to be out of poverty. So where do we miss? It's the middle part of China. It's where the Scott map show. There they will hit very hard. So how can we make sure that they can really be rebuilt better after the COVID-19? Now, the social protection is a big issue. That's another thing we have learned. So if you have a social protection system set up before the crisis, when the crisis comes, you will be much better prepared. So you can target the poor people. You can use that system to get your money, get your cash, or get your service into these people very quickly. So that's another thing we learned during this crisis. Now, finally, I wanted to emphasize the data and evidence, timely, reliable data on food prices, supply, demand, poverty, hunger, and so on. So I think the Chinese experience can be shared more broadly with Africans, with South Asians, with Latin Americans, and so on. And now, not surprisingly, I'm also participating in lots of webinars. And they all ask me, just like you asked Kevin or Xiaobo and others, how China has done this. How can we learn from China? What sort of mistakes these countries can avoid? So with that, I thank you. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed this webinar. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Katala. And thank you, all the speakers, Xiaobo, Xin Zhao, Kevin, and Scott.
Thank you very much, Zhangbin. And thank you to everyone for joining us for this important discussion. And a brief reminder to join us next week on August 4th at 9:30 a.m. when we will have the launch event for our new book on COVID-19 and global food security, which was released today. Stay safe, everyone.